Your story is really remarkable because when people at just a very, high level think Parkinson's, I think they immediately either think, someone who has some instability in their movement and Michael J. Fox. Those are sort of the things that people go to. And then I've been watching you for a while, and your TikTok is remarkable. The things that you're doing physically are things that most people who have trained with no medical conditions and all sorts of trainers and the best food and the best vitamins can't do. So you are really defying the face of early onset Parkinson's. Whatever inspired you to think, you know what? Lifting heavy things, pull-ups, push-ups, crazy physical things, I can do that.
Well, I didn't always believe that I could do that. But then when you think about it, exercise and exercise in any form translates to everyday life. And every time I'm having difficulty with a Parkinson's related symptom, a movement symptom, I always ask myself the question, what can I do in the gym that is going to help me live better in a day-to-day life, right? So and I always like to give this example. You already mentioned that fitness world record holder. So I have three records to my name, and one of them is burpees, number of chest to ground burpees in 1 minute. Now, if you think about it, as a person living with Parkinson's who always lose my balance, and I fall a lot. So one day I was asking myself, this is right before the pandemic, I was asking myself, what can I do in the gym that's going to help me in case I do fall? That's going to help me brace the fall and then also help me get back up, even if I'm in difficult positions and situations. And if you think about it, that is a burpee. Burpee is a controlled fall, and you're also getting yourself back up in the ground, right? So that's kind of gives you an idea of what really pushes me in the gym. And really, my motivation is to be able to control my body. If I can learn to control my body in the gym, I can control my body in everyday life.
How many burpees can you do in a minute?
So it was 32 chest to ground hand release burpees. So hand release means the hands must come off of the ground and I must fully extend to the side before bringing them back and come back up.
Okay, the thing about that, Jimmy, is that, I appreciate what a burpee can do for my physical fitness. That doesn't mean that I enjoy them. And so people avoid them at all costs. And here you are, someone who has many challenges, daily challenges that a lot of us don't even, we just take it for granted that we can do things like opening bottles and catch up
Yeah.
and whatever, and that are a legitimate struggle for you. And you're choosing to do burpees. That is, and for the reason you just mentioned, it's so inspiring.
Yeah, life is hard, right? Just like you mentioned, I can do all these things, but it'll take me 90 seconds to tie my shoes. My kids and my wife has to help me button the top button and when I wear a collared shirt or the button along my sleeves because I just can't do those things myself. Shaving is a bleeding hazard for me. So these are things that I avoid. But you said it right. These are things that people take for granted every day because they're simple. But they are tough and they're hard for me to do on a daily basis. And I think that also drives me in the gym. That's why I choose to do the hard things because life isn't, it's not easy.
Well, and the point about knowing what challenges could be coming, like a fall, and then what can I do to prepare myself so that when the difficult minute comes, I'm as prepared as possible. Of course, we never can be fully prepared because life throws things at us. But it's such a different way of looking at struggle that instead of turning the back and saying, oh boy, I hope it doesn't come, to say, you know what, it's coming. How can I get myself ready so that I can look at that struggle and be as ready as I possibly can for it?
Yeah. And that's the key right there is you never know what's coming. But as long you I best prepare my body for whatever might happen. And when it happens, I just have to trust my training.
And how often do you train?
I'm in the gym every day. So my full-time job now is keeping this body moving for the sake of my family, for my kids, for my wife. That is my full-time job. I am full-time retired from the corporate world. I was a former technology specialist, worked for Google, Microsoft, and all those big guys. Retired in 2018, and I've been a Parkinson's advocate for research and advocate for people in the Parkinson's community ever since.
And for folks who are listening to this and haven't yet looked you up on one of the social platforms or aren't able to pull over and to look at this on YouTube or Google you, how old are you?
So I am 47 today, and I
Is it
was
your birthday?
diagnosed. No,
No,
no, I'm sorry. No,
oh, okay. I was like,
I meant
wow, you should
now.
not be
Yeah,
with
now.
us.
No, now I'm 27 years old. But I was diagnosed, as you mentioned, 20 years ago, when I was only 27 years old.
Wow. So see, for people, the reason I asked you is because I think people think Parkinson's, they think older, and even when we say early onset. And let's be honest, men can say things like wife and children and be 75. You can have little kids as a man and be 75. If you were a woman, I think people would generally put you in an age category. But that's why I wanted to make sure that people got that your full-time job is staying physically active, and
Mhm.
you're not someone who is in the quote unquote typical retirement age.
Right, correct.
So I mentioned it in the introduction, but I think that the moment when you realized that you needed to do something different with your body was when we were holding your son, and you had a very frightening moment. Can you talk a little bit about that and share that? Because that ultimately, if I did my research correctly, that was the initial motivation that sparked the journey that you've been on with your body.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody has to have a rock bottom moment, and I like to describe that moment in time as my rock bottom. When I was diagnosed with the disease, I decided, just like probably any 20-something-year-old would do, is I was just going to go ahead and ignore the disease because it wasn't so bad at the time when I was diagnosed. But I ignored it for 8 years, and during that 8 years of time, the disease progressed so slowly, and I was constantly making adjustments to the progression that I didn't notice the progression myself. But anyone who hasn't seen me in a long time will take one look at me and say, "Whoa, what's going on with Jimmy?" Um, so 8 years I've gone at doing absolutely nothing. Lived on my life, just focused on my career. And then when my wife and I finally had kids, um, I became so inactive, and I just didn't realize I became so inactive that I gained a lot of weight, 240 pounds, and I was falling over a lot. And the way for me to work around that was to use a cane. So 8 years into my diagnosis, I was extremely overweight for my size and for my own personal body, and I was walking with a cane. And one day, my son was only 10 months old at the time, and we were coming down the stairs at my house. And I'm like, I've got the railing on one side, I've got my son in one arm, and maybe I can just leave my cane and I'll come and get it later, and everything's going to be fine. But sure enough, those like famous last words, right? You say something, you think something, and then that's completely wrong. And but the two of us tumbled down 10 steps, so an entire flight of stairs. And that really was it was a really scary moment because I realized at that point, a couple of things happened. I realized at that point that I was becoming a danger to my kids just by holding them, just by carrying them. I was a danger to my kids. Um, and as I was tumbling down those 10 steps, I kept Mason, who's my son, I kept him above my body the entire time. So I took the brunt of the fall. But my wife and my daughter, who was only 2 at the time, witnessed the fall. And when I looked up after hitting the ground, and just the sheer horror that I saw on their faces was enough to scare anybody. I think, and it really made me think hard right then and there. It's like, is this what I want with my life? Is have I become a burden to my wife? Have I become a safety hazard to my kids? Something has to change.
Wow, that's heavy and humbling. So you got in the gym the next day? You started doing research? Like how long?
No,
Because that you transformed your body, not just your life.
yeah, and then no, and for the next 12 years leading up to now, I've done many things, and but it didn't start in the gym right away. Actually, I didn't know what I was going to do. I certainly wasn't smart enough to find a cure myself, and certainly I didn't have the funds to fund the cure myself. So I looked around to see what kind of different things that I can do. Number one was educating myself, right? And in doing so, I realized that I can join all these different clinical trials and clinical researches that are going on. Because number one, during my research on the disease itself, remember this is 8 years later, and this really was the first time I opened up that pamphlet that they gave me when I was diagnosed. After when I was looking these things up, and I realized that there are a lot of clinical trials, and they are all starving for participants. And that was how I was going to help. I was going to sign up for as many as I possibly can. And I always say this because I want to give everybody the right frame as to my mindset at the time, because it's completely different than what it is now. Is at that time, one of the motivations for joining all these clinical trials was very selfish, because if I joined a clinical trial and that happened to be the cure, I would be the first person to get it, right? That's a very selfish way of thinking. And then the second reason for joining clinical trials was another selfish way of thinking, which was if I took my chances at these clinical trials and had to take medication that's questionable, or had to get a procedure done in my brain where it involved surgery, and I lost my life doing that. To be honest, that at that point in my life, that wasn't such a bad thing, right? So I want everybody to understand sort of where my frame of mind was at that time. Very, very, very self-centered and selfish. Um, so, but as I started taking part in clinical trials, one particular clinical trial was a forced exercise study. And this is where I went into a physical therapist's office. They hooked me up to a machine, and this machine it was, think of it as an incumbent bicycle. And they hooked me up, and then they just forced my legs to move. And I did this for a couple of sessions over a couple of months, a few sessions over a couple of months. And I realized that when I came home, I felt a little bit better. Like after I recovered from the effects of the machine itself, I realized I felt a little bit better. And what is there really something to this exercise thing, right? So I started doing a little bit more on my own with my family at home. So that's kind of really the start to my physical journey. I started walking with my cane and my family just around the block, see how far I can get today. And if I felt comfortable, I see how far I can get without my cane. And then very controlled, really just trying to do a little bit more each day. So, if I can get a block today, maybe tomorrow I'm trying to get a block and a half, and I'll leave my cane at home and try to get that block. And then I just kept going every day, a little bit more, a little bit more. Of course, I changed the way that I ate. I started eating healthier, cleaner, and the weight started coming off, and that was very helpful also. But really, that was the start of my journey. Realizing that just doing a little bit, I would feel a little bit better, and then that kind of became my drug. It became a very addicting to see these incremental changes and these incremental improvements on myself, right? So you can say that I got hooked on exercise, and I just kept pushing forward ever since.
How did the American Ninja Warrior idea happen? Because again, there's a lot of fit people out there. There's a lot of fit people who do have Parkinson's and don't have Parkinson's who aren't trying out for American Ninja Warrior.
Yes. As I was making my transformation, I actually first thing I did was I just started running. And I started doing 5Ks and 10Ks. And then remember that this time my kids were still 2 years old, 3 years old. My son was still, a toddler, an infant. But as time went on, as my kids got older, from what they can remember, I've always been running in their memory. So, to my daughter, I've always been fit, right? Because I started running marathons. In fact, I've done over 16 marathons and 105 half marathons, I think, in the last 12 years. And to my kids and my daughter, I've always been fit. And my daughter loved watching American Ninja Warrior. And in 2015, 2016, that was kind of like when the show really started gaining its popularity, and she watched it every year. And every year she's like, "Dad, you should try it. You should get on." And I gave her all the excuses. I have Parkinson's. Are you kidding me? grip strength, upper body strength, and balance. These are things that are not right for a person with Parkinson's. Um, and then, as you watch the show, you realize that they feature a lot of athletes who have overcome their own, adversities, right? So one time we were watching, and all these stories come up, and then she finally, my daughter turns to me and she just looks at me and says, "Dad, what's your excuse? I don't think you have an excuse." And she was right. I don't have an excuse, and I've always told my kids at that time just to try something scary, try something new, right? But in reality, I decided to apply just to shut her up. I'm like, there's no way they're gonna pick me, right? So I'm just gonna apply, and then we'll see what happens. And then, sure enough, a couple months later, they called me and say, "Hey, man, we're gonna give you a shot. Get ready." And that was in 2017, and that was my first time on the show, and I competed for the next 5 years on the show.